Good morning. How is everyone? I hope this video finds you well. Today, what we're going to do is to look at the introductory dialogue and then look at Phaedrus's speech. It's a short speech, short and sweet, and it has a structure that is really crucial for us. The basic claim I made in the introductory video was that the Symposium establishes a literary form of myth or poetry. And when we look at Phaedrus's speech, it is really a paradigmatic example of a poetic myth, right? A myth. And in fact, what he gives us in explaining Eros is an origin myth. So we'll look at a little of the structure of the speech, very simply in terms of the logic of it, the actual literary structure, but then also the structure of the concepts. That speech, once we understand how that speech works, we're going to see the same, or at least a very similar format play out in all the subsequent speeches. And particularly the first two speeches, Phaedrus and Pausanias, are essentially replications of the same type of structure. And what's really interesting about these speeches is, and for this will be true of all the characters, is where they start in their claims about what they're going to tell us and where they end up. They make some very interesting claims, and one thing I want to highlight is the way in which these claims seem to reflect their own personal interests and personal biases. Plato as a philosopher, Socrates as a philosopher, is seeking the truth, but they're particularly keenly aware of the way in which each person's perspective and their background, their nature influences their own way of thinking, which is the challenge of philosophy, to overcome what we would call a kind of subjective biases and things of that sort. And of course, this is a topic of love. So is it not entirely appropriate that people's own subjective points of view become part of this, the understanding of the phenomena itself, given how personal, how intimate it is? So what I'm going to do now is turn to the introductory dialogue, and we're just going to read it and have fun with it. And I would like you to have the text in front of you and to really read along, because I want to kind of mull over some of the very unusual and funny things that happen here. And there's a sense of levity throughout this whole text, of humor. And there's just a sense, a general kind of warmth between the characters and a kind of camaraderie, even when they disagree and even when they don't have the greatest degree of intimacy between them. And we talked about the way in which the distinction between a myth and a logos. And a myth shows you, it exemplifies the concepts or the ideas that it wants to explain to you. And it doesn't want to do it in an explainy way. It wants to get you wrapped up in the drama, absorbed in the emotions, absorbed in the interest of the characters, and almost make you forget that what you're actually getting is certain concepts that the author is, if not trying to assert ideologically, they're trying to mull over in their mind and get you to think about too. Whereas we looked at, obviously, Aristotle, one of the challenges with Aristotle is not only the complexity of his text and the structure of it, but also it's really dry, right? I mean, it is telling rather than telling rather than and explaining rather than showing. And one of the joys of the Symposium that makes its form commensurate with its topic is the way in which we get wrapped up in the amusement of these characters and learn about them. And this is a text, the more you come to it, the more you learn about these characters and the more amusing they actually become. When you start to see what's going on, because there's many subtle things, there's many layers of meaning here. Some things are fairly explicit and some things are fairly subtle. So when we look at this introductory dialogue, we just want to have fun with what we're learning about the characters and what they do and say, what it really says about them by implication. So we're going to look at the introductory dialogue, and we're going to look at Phaedrus's speech. So just to recap a few important things, we've got a situation that shows us rather than tells us. We notice that all the friends, and I think friend is the appropriate term here, they're warm, they're intimate. Agathon tells them to act as if they're in their own household, act as if they're all masters, mikasa sukasa. We see the presence of masters and slaves, And this calls to mind the division in life between situations in which of necessity and compulsion, where we have no choice, and circumstances in which we have choice, we have voluntary action and consensual agreement on things, which is to say agreement by choice. And of course, friendship and love, we'd say, demands the circumstances or demands the condition of a certain type of freedom and choice to be able to enter into a friendship or a love relationship. It's not something that can be compelled, right? And this goes back to some kind of fundamental element of human nature. It both has the potential to act freely, to live a life of choice and alternatives, but it also needs the conditions of freedom to actually live a fully human life. So we could just talk about the way in which these people engage in Aristotelian exchanges, in friendship. And what do they exchange? Warm gestures, and they exchange speeches. And it points to their interest in the goods of the soul. It points to their interest, at least ostensibly. I think we'll see some variation there, right? The three lives, the life of the mind or contemplation, the life of pleasure, and the life of utility. You can see how these three lives come out in these characters in different ways. But they're exchanging speeches, right? And that becomes the main thrust of what they're engaged in. We notice that Socrates is at the center of attention, and I think this is important because there's this kind of parallel between Eros being the focus and Socrates being the focus, and which one is really the focus? We might even raise that question. The entire corpus of Platonic dialogues puts Socrates and his way of life, his character, his actions at the center of them, as held up as something to be admired, to be thought on, to be mused on, and all the characters here are engaged in that kind of amusement with Socrates. And we said there's something charismatic about him. There's something beguiling about him. There's something magnetic, and this is really interesting because here is a character who is not attractive and actually of low social status. Most historians think that his family came from a line of artisans, so it actually would have been he's not a nobility, and he's actually amongst people of very high status, and of course he is capable of you could say hanging with them because of his intellectual gifts that everyone cannot but recognize. Apollodorus is the guy who's most smitten. He says, "I know it's my job. It's my job." He said, "It's a job." We all know one thing. This is not a job. It's my job to know exactly what he does and says each day, right? Apollodorus is obsessed with Socrates, like Aristotemus, right? And immediately in that obsession with Socrates, we see the effects of Eros, right? We see the effects of Eros exemplified. It's shown us rather than told, and it's rather compelling. So when they actually start giving these speeches, everyone is sitting in a circle, and they follow a ritual of going around in a certain direction and giving the speeches. And of course, not everyone has spoken, and some people get skipped over for a while, and so on and so forth. A circle is a symbol of wholeness, symbol of completeness, symbol of harmony. I think all these things are relevant. The completeness of friendships, the completeness of oneself and self-love that allows one to engage in a friendship, and our desire for the theme of the desire for wholeness, right? Which is a theme of Aristophanes' speech. He says love results in completeness because love is pursuing our other half, which is to say love is the process of, or is the desire that pursues wholeness. And wholeness is really just another word for completeness. And for Aristotle, completeness of an individual is synonymous with happiness. Because what is happiness? Happiness is the fulfillment of our native capacities to their fullest extent, and certain capacities connected with the soul, with reason, and so on. there is a sense that as this discussion goes along, that Socrates displaces Eros as the objects of everyone's concern and desire. And if you think about it, Eros turns out not to be an end, but a means. It is desire of something, and what we really want is the thing, not Eros itself. In fact, Eros can turn out to be a very frustrating thing because desire suggests that your desire is not going fulfilled. Then, of course, there are 6 speeches, but it turns out there's a 7th. And in the last speech, the speaker relates that he too was smitten, even mesmerized, by the intoxicating effects of Socrates' presence. Okay. Let's now turn to the introductory dialogue and read. So please have this in front of you. Have your book in front of you. And Apollodorus starts. He says, "In fact, your question does not find me unprepared. Just the other day, as it happens, I was walking to the city from my home in Phaleron, where a man I know, who was making his way behind me, saw me and called from the distance. 'The gentleman from Phaleron,' he yelled, trying to be funny. 'Hey, Apollodorus, wait!' So I stopped and waited. 'Apollodorus, I've been looking for you,' he said. 'You know, there was once a gathering at Agathon's when Socrates, Alcibiades, and their friends had dinner together. I wanted to ask you about the speeches they made on love.' 'What were they?' 'Curiosity. I heard a version from a man who had heard it from Phoenix.' Now notice, I heard a version from a man who had heard it from Phoenix, who himself was not there, who must have heard it from someone else, who possibly heard it from someone else. So you've got the telephone game, right? Phoenix, Philip's son, but it was badly garbled. And he said, you were the one to ask. So for some reason, Apollodorus has the authoritative account of this event, which is interesting because, in effect, Apollodorus is a kind of minor player here. And he wasn't there himself. And notice the expression badly garbled, right? This it directly alludes to a kind of telephone game in which, as a message is passed on down, its original content is distorted, and no one knows what the relationship is between the story, the words, and what actually happened. So please, will you tell me about it? So people have, let's put it this way, they have an erotic desire for this story because they want to know the down low. They want to know what happened. There was something mysterious, and I've said that it either has, or it's a combination of things. It either has to do with the fact that they were talking about love, or it has to do with the fact that there were things happen there that were simply not appropriate for public discussion, yet the very kind of things you're really intrigued to know about that happened behind closed doors. After all, Socrates is your friend. Who has a better right than you to report the conversation? Before you begin, he adds, let me tell this. Were you there yourself? Right? So he wants first-hand knowledge, because of course that's going to be better knowledge. And he says, Socrates is your friend, which implies that Glaucon's not as close to him. But friend, right? And, philia, this word is connected with love. And it's very clear that Apollodorus loves Socrates. Not in an erotic way, not in an intimate relationship way, but there is a clear attachment that is in many ways rather innocent and naive, as strange as it seems for grown men to act this way. Your friend must have really garbled his story, I replied, if you think this affair was so recent that I could have been there. So now he establishes not only was he not there, but that this happened long ago. And this captures, remember, this is all a framing technique to show us that the original event is kind of clouded or veiled in mystery in time and also in the direct evidence reports from this event, because very few people have direct report. Glaucon, and then furthermore that people's curiosity is piqued. Glaucon, how could you? You know very well Agathon hasn't lived in Athens for many years, while it's been less than 3 that I've been Socrates' companion and made it my job to know exactly what he says and does each day. That's odd. Before that, I simply drifted aimlessly. Think about the implications of that. The man had no purpose in life. He was experiencing ennui, malaise, a blasé existence, and he meets Socrates, and the clouds open and the sun shines down, right? And he finds a purpose in life. He finds meaning in life. And of course, there's an interesting question for the student of Plato. What is he really fascinated by? Is he really fascinated by philosophy and learning, gaining knowledge and wisdom himself? Or is he simply smitten with Socrates? Because I'd argue those two things are not the same thing. Of course, I used to think that what I was doing was important. But in fact, I was the most worthless man on earth, as bad as you are at this very moment. I used to think philosophy was the last thing a man should do. Now notice this character is kind of subject to hyperbole and like strong emotions, right? He's not the normal person. He has a very, you might even say strong erotic impulse in terms of his emotions, right? And notice he says that the most important thing is philosophy. And this is what, in effect, Aristotle says, the highest form of life is the life of contemplation. However crazy that sounds, here we have a crazy character saying that that's the highest form of life, really reiterating what Aristotle, the student of Plato, would later on say. "Stop joking, Apollodorus," he replied. Now remember, he's speaking to Glaucon, and he's reciting a conversation that happened the day prior, and in fact, he's speaking to the friend, reciting his conversation with Glaucon the day before. "Stop," and now Glaucon is speaking. "Stop joking, Apollodorus," he replied. "Just tell me when the party took place. When we were still children, when Agathon won the prize, with his first tragedy. It was the day after he and his troop held their victory celebration." So it really was a long time ago. It was really only about 10 years. He said, but this guy's fairly young, so that seems like a long time for him. "Then who told you about it? Was it Socrates himself?" "Oh, for God's sake, of course not," I replied. "It was the very same man who told Phoenix, a fellow called Aristotemus, from Cythidanium, a real runt of a man who always went barefoot. He went to the party because I think he was obsessed with Socrates, one of the worst cases at the time. Naturally, I checked part of the story with Socrates, and Socrates agreed with his account." So notice some very interesting things. We talked about how Socrates refuses to talk about this event, either from a sense of decorum and appropriateness, propriety, like what's appropriate in public to talk about. But so what does Socrates say? No comment. But here's the interesting thing. Then Apollodorus learns from Aristotemus, and then he cross-checks it with Socrates, and Socrates then confirms the account, despite the fact that he said he wasn't going to tell him anything about it. He was obsessed with Socrates. What are we seeing here? The effects of Eros, right? One of the worst cases at the time. You know what this makes it sound like? It sounds like he has a disease. He's got a disease. What's wrong with him? He's afflicted. He's afflicted. So we see Eros as a kind of a drug, or even a metaphor, analogy as a disease that afflicts people in their soul. Right? And of course, Apollodorus is afflicted with the same disease. And we'll see this little motif come up again. "Please tell me then," he said. "You'll speak and I'll listen as we walk to the city." This is a perfect opportunity. And there seems to be a theme here that they're outside of like kind of the town square. They're kind of walking. They're not in a private space, obviously, in the sense of being in a house, but they're in a way that they can talk privately without other people overhearing them because of the sensitive nature of the conversation. So this is what we talked about on our way, and that's why, as I said before, I am not unprepared. He's already rehearsed the story. "Well, if I'm to tell you about it, I'll be glad to. After all, my greatest pleasure comes from philosophical conversation, even if I'm only a listener, whether or not I think it will be to my advantage." So as we see at the Symposium, Aristotemus is just a listener. "All other talk, especially the talk of rich businessmen like you, bores me to tears. And I'm sorry for you and your friends because you think that your affairs are important when really they're totally trivial. Perhaps, in your own turn, you think I'm a failure. And believe me, I think what you think is true. But as for all of you, I don't just think you are failures. I know you are failures. So what's going on here? First of all, the friend and Apollodorus know each other, right? They're also friendly enough to have a fundamental disagreement about actually what their lives are all about, right? How many people can you actually have that with? And Apollodorus is kind of so kooky that it's almost like he can get away with saying this and it's not a big deal. And what's the significance of one being into wealth, and not necessarily great riches, but just wealth, and one being into philosophy? Well, one has practical concerns. He also has very conventional concerns, right? The kind of concerns everybody has. And, material well-being, right? And obviously, looking at Aristotle, that's a priority for everybody. One has to have a basic level of material well-being to do the things they want to do, let alone having, opulence and luxury and great wealth. And of course, if we look at Socrates and these other characters, we know, like Apollodorus, we notice that they don't have much money, right? They live a kind of life of poverty, kind of an ascetic life, right? And it's not because they're trying to live a poor life. It's because they're so fascinated by their own intellectual curiosity that they just don't care, which also makes them very strange. We're naturally inclined here to identify with the friend because his conventional concerns are our conventional concerns. But what it illustrates is just how conventional we all are. But nonetheless, we find Socrates and Apollodorus so interesting. There's something that piques. Despite our differences, we continue on. We want to know about what happened at the symposium. You'll never change, Apollodorus, always nagging, even at yourself. I do believe you think everybody, yourself first of all, is totally worthless, except, of course, Socrates. Now think about what love does. Love elevates someone and we're talking about a little bit crazy love here, right? I mean, teenage love, kind of innocent love that doesn't have perspective, right? He puts Socrates on a pedestal, and there's such an obsession that everything else seems totally and utterly insignificant by comparison. I don't know exactly how you came to be called the maniac. That's not exactly an endearing term, but it almost sounds here. But you certainly talk like one, always furious with everyone, including yourself, but not with Socrates. Now that's interesting. Socrates has the ability to I would say, tame this character. This character is, they're not, I wouldn't call them aggressive. I wouldn't call Apollodorus, he seems like a very actually passive character in many ways, but he's got a high emotional tenor, right? And Socrates kind of puts him at ease. Something about Socrates' presence. And this will be true in a sense of all the characters. Socrates will have this kind of magnetic effect on people. Apollodorus. Of course, my dear friend, it's perfectly obvious why I have these views about us all. It's simply because I am a maniac and I'm raving. Now, of course, the question is he being serious here? Is he being ironic? I mean, is he telling a half-truth? I mean, anybody who's crazy, the last thing they do is say they're crazy, because that's crazy. You don't, when you're a little cuckoo, you don't admit it to other people, right? So what does it mean that he's admitting it here? I think there's probably a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here. On the other hand, it's also, it's kind of like double irony, because it's partly false, but it's partly true at the same time. The friend says, it's not worth arguing about this now, Apollodorus. Apparently he likes to argue with people. Please do as I ask. Tell me the speeches. We want to know the speeches. We want to know the speeches. All right. Well, the speeches went something like this. But I'd better tell you the whole story from the very beginning, as Aristotelis told it to me. So notice, he doesn't just jump to the speeches, which is what they really want to know. He gives the context of now the introductory dialogue that happens between the characters involved in the symposium. And here's the moment where Apollodorus shifts into diegesis, into the narration of these events, and now his voice is just going to kind of drop out, and it's going to be as if we're looking directly at the events themselves that he's narrating. We won't really be aware that he's narrating at a certain point. And it's interesting because Plato could have said, and he could have pulled back to this conversation with the friend and reminded us that it's being narrated, but that doesn't happen. What does that mean? Okay, so here we go. Aristotle's narration. He said then that one day he ran into Socrates, who had just bathed and put on his sandals. Now, who is the he? The he is Aristotlemus, because he's learning this story from Aristotlemus. Socrates had just bathed and put on very fancy sandals, both very unusual events. So he asked him whether he was going and why he was looking so good. Socrates was looking good. He bathed himself and he put on fancy sandals, both very unusual events, right? Bathing, an unusual event. Socrates doesn't normally bathe. He doesn't normally put on at least fancy sandals, but maybe not fancy sandals at all. He's reported to go around barefoot a lot of the time, but perhaps wasn't the most unusual behavior, in ancient Athens. We're probably just used to doing things like that. However, what does it point to? Let me give you a suggestion. Socrates doesn't care about his looks. He doesn't care about his appearance, right? He doesn't care about the things that everyone cares about to get by in society, how they present themselves. He doesn't, to other people. He doesn't care about the things that you and I care about and feel obliged. We feel obliged to present ourselves properly in the proper context, because we want to represent ourselves well, because we care about what? We care about what other people think. And you see now how this ties in with Aristotle's discussion of friendship, and that friends are the people you act on the stage of life, and the friends are the people who judge you, right? And Socrates doesn't seem to care about the opinions of other people. And this is really crucial, because as much as Socrates is warm or open and engaged with other people, he also doesn't seem to care about their opinions at all. And of course, he doesn't, the principle of Socrates' life, in a sense, is do no harm. Whatever I do, whatever I engage in my desire, I have an obligation to do it in a way that doesn't harm others. So he has internalized a kind of code of conduct such that he's not going to harm other people, but he also doesn't care about their opinions, right? And it seems rather detached. In fact, it's precisely when we're intimate with others that we both care about their opinions and we wrong them because precisely in some cases because we care about their opinions of us, or they don't think the right things about us and we don't like that. This also ties into the fact that Socrates is ugly, and the best way to describe it is he's fugly, right? He's an unattractive man, and yet people are completely fascinated with him despite his appearance, right? They overcome the oddity of his appearance, and I'll put up a picture eventually of roughly what he must have looked like, because all the sculptures are kind of unanimous in how he's depicted. And we come back to love. Love and beauty go together. I only love what's beautiful. Well, let's face it. Socrates' dress ain't beautiful. He ain't wearing fancy labels. Socrates doesn't wash. He doesn't put... The magnetic appeal is not his cologne. God knows what he smelled like. Right? And it's not his face, because he's ugly. What's the expression? You get beat with the ugly stick. Right? Maybe his mama dropped him. Right? But what he has beautiful is his soul. Right? And the entire Platonic philosophy is built around the things that really matter are immaterial, intangible, invisible things like souls and minds and virtues of the soul and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of a riff on a book and its cover, and it's not just people come along and say, I don't judge Socrates by the cover. It's, I see what's inside already, and I'm drawn to it, right? That's how powerful his force is. This also ties in not just with love, but with poetry, right? The truth is ugly and poetry is beautiful, and in making the world beautiful, poetry has to lie a little bit, has to fudge, because what's beautiful? Having our own expectations stroked. We want a depiction of the world that's pleasant to our aspirations and our hopes and our dreams, and that means fudging the truth a little bit. Put it this way: poetry and myth are appearances and are concerned with appearances. They're not the reality. They're not the truth. Words paint a picture of things that has a dubious relationship to the truth, right? So poetry is a kind of image, right? If philosophy gets at the thing behind the truth, then perhaps the truth is not as beautiful as we'd like it to be. Socrates replies, I'm going to Agathon's for dinner. I managed to avoid yesterday's victory party. I really don't like crowds. He's not a crowd guy. You're not going to find him at 42nd Street, Times Square. But I promised to be there today, so naturally I took great pains, he's being ironic here, with my appearance. I'm going to the house of a good-looking man. I had to look my best. Let me ask you this, he added. I know you haven't been invited to the dinner. How would you like to come anyway? So a couple important things. Agathon's name is actually derived from the word good. In Greek, the word good is agathos. So Agathon, his name is something like he's good or good man, right? And Socrates says he's a good-looking man, or maybe he's just a good man. The key thing here is he appears good. And I think on one level, he literally is a handsome man. That's acknowledged. He has a lot of traits of like the kind of stereotypically popular person in society. But this already establishes our competition over Eros. Good looking in what way? Or in body or soul? And then, is he just good looking but not really good? The difference between appearance and reality that we saw in Book 9 of the... and, what does everybody pursue? Aristotle makes it very clear. We all pursue the good. We all pursue what we think is good for us. So his name has many kind of amusing resonances here. And obviously Socrates is trying to compete with him. He said, I'm going to a good-looking man's house. I better look good myself. Problem is, you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? And if I'm being cruel to Socrates, it's only because I know he can take it. He's a big boy, and he doesn't care about his looks. So it's all good. So we've already had the competition established. Who is the truly good man? And Aristotlemus answered, I'll do whatever you say. I'll do whatever you say. He's like a slave, right? See, this is one big difference between friendship and eros. Friendship is predicated on equality. Erotic desire for another person very often results in relationships of profound inequality, because the person who is the lover will do anything for the beloved, right? If they can get what they want. Come with me then, Socrates said, and we shall prove the proverb wrong. The truth is, good men go uninvited to a good man's feasts. Even Homer himself, when you think about it, young as you are... Oh, I skipped a page here. Even Homer himself did not much like the proverb. He not only disregarded it, he violated it. Agamemnon, so this is a story from Homer's Iliad. Agamemnon, of course, is one of the great warriors, while he describes Menelaus as a limp spearman. And yet, when Agamemnon offers a sacrifice and gives a feast, Homer has the weak Menelaus arrive uninvited at the superior's table. So now we clearly have invoked a competition, because this analogy speaks to Socrates arriving at Agathon's. Is an analogy with Agamemnon and Menelaus from the Iliad. And the point is, who is superior? And also about who can show up at someone's house uninvited. Well, let's ask the question. Who can pull off showing up at someone's house uninvited? The superior person or the inferior person? The geek or the cool kid? And what we're talking about here is really social dynamics that are straight out of middle school and high school, and that maybe still exist in certain circles as you get older. The inferior person is not going to be allowed in uninvited to the cool kid's house. Why? Because think of what that would do for the cred of the cool kids. It would depreciate it. They have to not let that person in to keep, because the lower person doesn't have, they're not on the list to get in. They're not cool enough. And they're going to lower the bar of the whole party, obviously, right? Whereas the hip person can go to the geek's party, and the geeks are going to let them in because they're going to raise the tenor of the whole party, right? And it's going to be beneficial to them. So, can Socrates go uninvited to Agathon's house? Who's the superior character? If Socrates is superior, he should be able to walk in without being invited. Now, it turns out, let's let the cat out of the bag, Socrates is superior. I think that's the way the text presents him. And of course, Agathon wanted to invite him anyway. So it ended up being almost a non-issue, but it is an important issue because we're in a competition here between a philosopher and a tragic poet, and between a guy who is, you might say, authentic, and Agathon who is maybe less than authentic, kind of narcissistic, I think we see. A self-lover, right? Socrates is a true self-lover, and Agathon is a narcissistic self-lover in the negative sense. Socrates, I'm afraid Homer's description is bound to fit me better than you. Mine is a case of the obvious inferior arriving uninvited at the table of a man of letters. Of course, he has just won this great award at the Leonaean festival, and of course, therefore, Agathon has this kind of street cred here. Aristotemus has just acknowledged that he's an inferior. How is he gonna get in? Because he's kind of a nobody compared to all these like luminaries who are showing up at this party. He says, I think you'd better figure out a good excuse for bringing me along, because you know I won't admit I've come without an invitation. I'll say I'm your guest. Let's go, he said. We'll think about what to say as we proceed, for the two of us along the way. Two going together are better to think and to act. Right? It's straight out of Aristotle's Ethics. With these words they set out, but as they were walking, Socrates began to think about something, lost himself in thought, and kept lagging behind. Now, first of all, what is he doing here? And isn't he in a social circumstance where what you do is you make a point consciously of being attentive to the partner you're spending time with? He obviously, Aristotemus has this passion for Socrates, but Socrates doesn't return the favor. Sorry, you might be into me, but I'm busy thinking, right? That's strange. That's strange. And it's funny, too. When he arrived at Agathon's, he found the gate wide open, welcoming, and open and free and harmonious. And that Aristotemus said caused him to find himself in a very embarrassing situation. A household slave saw him on the moment he arrived and took him immediately to the dining room, where the guests were already lying down on their couches and dinner was about to be served. So Socrates is going to show up fashionably late, number one. But number two, he ditched Aristotemus, and now Aristotemus has to show up as the inferior man to the superior man's house. And the question is, how is he going to be greeted? And we all know how he gets treated. He gets treated very well by Agathon. Why? Because Agathon's a good guy, which might be in the sense that he shows the virtue of friendliness and goodwill and camaraderie. Not a type of great self-sacrifice or altruism, but a general warmth. But then the question is, why has he done that? What's his motive in being so nice to Aristotemus? And also, what was he really doing? And I think there are two answers. I'll just kind of touch on them now. He either fell asleep. He either was deeply lost in thought And in fact, there is, if you look at the other Platonic dialogues and other historical writings on Socrates, there are reports of him literally standing for hours in the middle of the agora or in the middle of winter, thinking, just lost deep in thought, a kind of, not exactly meditation, but it's meditative, but in a kind of transfixed state of contemplation about things. And it's almost an image of the contemplative, what the contemplative life looks like. And boy, that life looks strange. A man who disregards his body on a way to a party to think. The other way of thinking about it is Socrates might be pulling his leg. This whole thinking process may be a pretext to purposely ditch Aristotemus and have him show up at the house uninvited as the inferior man to see what happens to him. Throw him to the lions. Throw him to the lions. So how does he get treated? As soon as Agathon saw him, he called, "Welcome, Aristotemus! What perfect timing! You're just in time for dinner. I hope you're not here for any other reason. If you are, forget it. I looked all over yesterday so I could invite you, but I couldn't find you anywhere. But where is Socrates? Where is Socrates? How come you didn't bring him along?" Oh, what kind of guy is Agathon? He's a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a good man. And he's a good host. And he is a genuinely good host, although it's a rather superficial role, right? So he treats the inferior. This man has just won the Oscar. He's got like an entourage. He's got all types of intention around him. And here is Aristotemus. I mean, people know him, but in the status game of society, he's nobody, right? He's nobody. And Agathon treats him with great respect and as an equal, despite the fact that they're actually not equals in many ways, depending on what your criteria is to judge their relative merit, right? Which is another issue at play here. So he wanted to invite Aristotemus all along. So in effect, he's not coming uninvited because he wanted to invite him. Then the question is, why does he want to invite this little runt of a man who's obsessed with Socrates? Well, it becomes clear in the question. Oh, essentially, "Oh, Aristotemus, it's so great to see you. Where is Socrates?" I think the only reason he invited Aristotemus, or intended to, was because he wanted Socrates. So this goes back, everybody wants a piece of Socrates. Agathon, this guy is the stud of society. He's the one being feted right now. And he wants to see Socrates. He's a fan. Everyone is a fan. I mean, what does the word fan come from? Fanatic. Everyone's a fan of Socrates. "So I turned around," Aristotemus said, "and Socrates was nowhere to be seen. And I said this was actually Socrates who had brought me along as his guest." So Socrates was nowhere in sight. So Socrates would have functioned as like the hookup to get into the club. You come up with your friend who is on the list, and the bouncer goes, "Hey, you're not on the list. You're out of here." And then you go, "Oh, no. I'm with them, right? I'm with the hip person who's got a connection." And they go, oh, I get it. On your way in. He says, "I'm delighted," he said. Agathon replied. "But where is he?" Agathon wants a piece of Socrates. And why does he want him? Does he want to have conversation with him? Or does he want him, we have to propose this, does he want him sexually? Right? Because there's one of the big themes, obviously, of the Symposium is male-male love, and explicit erotic sexual love at that. And one wonders that now that Agathon is a big shot, that he thinks he can get whoever he wants. I mean, one need only look at Hollywood a little to understand how that works, and the way in which when people have status, it's they use it to get access to people because the people are so smitten by it. But is a guy like Socrates going to be affected by it? I don't think so. So it says, "Go and look for Socrates." Agathon ordered a slave, right? So here we get this highlighting the slave. I mean, Plato could have written this in a way in which the slaves or servants are not touched upon at all, but it highlights the distinction between the voluntary relationships of the friends and lovers versus the compelled relationship of the master to the slave, or the slave to the master. And bring him in, Aristodemus. He added, you can share Arisomachus's couch. A slave brought water, and Aristodemus washed himself before he lay down. Then another slave entered and said, Socrates is here, but he's gone off to the neighbor's porch. He's standing there and won't come in, even though I've called him several times. He's indifferent to the empirical world of the senses around him. He's deep in his mind, his intellect. Go back and bring him in. Don't leave him there. So notice Agathon is ordering people around, not unlike Polemarchus, but it's going to be a much lighter touch here. But he wants to order Socrates to come in, right? But Aristodemus stopped him. He said, no, he said, leave him alone. It's one of his habits. Every now and then he just goes off like that and stands motionless wherever he happens to be. I'm sure he'll come in very soon, so don't disturb him. Let him be. What is he really doing? I mean, I suppose he is deep in thought at this point, because the whole interaction with Aristodemus and Agathon has already happened. Is he illustrating what a philosopher looks like, erotically attached to wisdom or knowledge or understanding, and that this is what they do? Remember Book 10 of the Ethics. The person of contemplation needs very little. They just need their faculties and the world to think about. They don't even need friends. They are close to being as self-sufficient as a human can be. Now, isn't that exactly what Socrates looks like here? With the irony that other people want him, but he doesn't really want other people. He does want something from them, but it's not them, right? He does have relationships of utility with other people. He doesn't want them for their own sake. He wants them as a point of departure for gaining wisdom. But he repeatedly talks about, particularly in the Apology, he goes around society asking people questions about their own knowledge, their own expertise, right? Agathon responds. He says, "How strange," Agathon replied. "Go back and bring him in." And Aristodemus says, no. And then Agathon says, "Well, all right, if you really think so," Agathon said, and turned to the slaves. "Go ahead and serve the rest of us. What you serve is completely up to you. Pretend nobody's supervising you, as if I ever did. Imagine that we are all your guests, myself included. Give us good reason to praise your service." So, to some degree, he treats the servants as somewhat equal. But Aristodemus knows Socrates. He knows his habits. He knows this habit of standing there motionless in contemplation. Agathon does not seem to know that this is the kind of thing Socrates does, and therefore he can't understand why you'd leave him out there. It's like bring him in, right? And what does it say about Agathon? It says he knows of Socrates. He knows about Socrates, but he doesn't have an intimate personal knowledge of Socrates and the details of his life. And of course, Aristodemus does, because he spends every day following everything Socrates does. So Socrates, of course, then comes fashionably late, right? Because we all know what the superior person does. If they're going to an inferior person's party, they don't need to show up on time. They can do what they want and make a statement about their status relative to the people showing up. And Socrates does seem to have this subtle competitive streak here. So they went ahead and started eating, but there was still no sign of Socrates. Agathon wanted to send for him many times, but Aristodemus wouldn't let him. And in fact, Socrates came in shortly afterward, as he always did. They were hardly halfway through the meal. Agathon, who, as it happens, was alone on the farthest couch, immediately called, "Socrates, come lie down next to me. Who knows, if I touch you, I may catch a bit of your wisdom that came to you under my neighbor's porch. It's clear you've seen the light. If you hadn't, you'd still be standing there. Okay, so there's some very funny things. Agathon first demands Socrates sit down next to him. Now, what does Eros do for other people? And for, Eros is a desire, a deep yearning for that thing we lack. Therefore, precisely it's that thing we lack that we become so possessive over. That's jealousy, right? We jealously want the thing for ourselves. We don't want the thing to stop us from having it, and we don't want other people from getting it away. And we see a serious type of possessiveness, and this may illustrate Agathon's desire, but also his feeling that Socrates is going to be an easy mark for him because Agathon is young and handsome, number one. Number two, he's won this contest. And number three, he thinks Socrates is somehow some kind of sexual interest in him. And it may turn out that Socrates does not have an interest in eroticism of the sexual kind at all, right? And that remains to be seen. That's one of the interesting mysteries of this text. But he clearly is not interested in it here, and he plays games with it. So he says, clearly you've seen the light because you were standing out there contemplating. He's been explained what Socrates has been doing. So likely that was what he was doing. Come and lie next to me. Who knows, if I touch you, I may catch a bit of your wisdom that came to you under the neighbor's porch. Right? Now think about that. A couple things. If I touch you, I may catch something. Right? It almost sounds like, well, maybe I'll catch the affliction that Aristoteles and Apollodorus had. It almost sounds like catching STD. And when he says, if I touch you, I mean, he's talking about just actually touching him and the wisdom being transferred from the one person to the other. But of course it implies a sexual act, at least through kind of innuendo, right? And this text is just rife with innuendo. It is not going to spell out its erotic or sexual content in any way. And it's rather amusing. So he says, if I touch you, I may catch a bit of your wisdom. And he seems to think that wisdom can be transmitted through osmosis, right? You touch the thing with the wisdom, and it's like downloading the information from one to the other. Now, of course, we know that can't happen. But furthermore, it implies, what if I touch you just means sex? Is there a circumstance in which a sexual relationship can produce wisdom? Now, that's an interesting question. If you think about the Bible, Adam and Eve, when it's described that Adam and Eve copulate, it says Adam knew his wife. And it's interesting that the verb that's used is to know. And what is it you have learned? It implies that there is some type of maybe emotional knowledge or a type of emotional or wisdom communicated through sex. And that's an interesting topic in and of itself. But can sex produce wisdom? Well, let's leave that as an open question, but let's be clear. In Pausanias' speech, he talks about a lover and a beloved, an older man and a younger man engaged in a sexual relationship that he claims is a form of mentorship that results in wisdom. Wisdom. So in fact, what we see here is that this passage really foreshadows a central theme, a subtle but central theme of the text. It also implies that Socrates is wiser than Agathon, right? Just by the statement, right? If I touch you, I'll get your wisdom. Why? Because I don't have it and I claim to want it. Now, does he mean this seriously? Right? He seems to be joking, right? He's tongue in cheek. He's flirting with Socrates. He's flirting. Because what does he really want? I mean, Socrates, think about what Socrates is coming for. I'm there for the talk, right? And Agathon has said, I'm pretending to be here for the talk, but the talk is just an excuse to get at you, right? I think people can probably relate and understand to that kind of bait and switch strategy in people's intimate lives. Socrates sat down next to him and said, "How wonderful it would be, dear Agathon, if the foolish were filled with wisdom simply by touching the wise." Hasn't he just accused Agathon of being foolish and himself as being wise? And then that's a rather boastful statement, but then the question comes up, is it true? And I would think, just on the observation of the Platonic dialogues, Socrates is always presented as wise, and he says things that are wise and does things that are wise, and he's kind of proved his status. So I think he just put Agathon down, and in fact it's going to get worse. "If only wisdom were like water, which flows from one cup into a full cup into an empty one when connected with a piece of yarn. Well, then, I would consider it the greatest prize to have the chance to lie down next to you. I would soon be overflowing with your wonderful wisdom." Now, wait a second. Now he claims it's Agathon who has the wisdom and he has none. Right? And actually, this is irony. He's actually putting him down. You know, it's like calling the dumbest person in school, Mr. Einstein. Right? When we say that of the guy we all know is the dumbest person in school, we're really actually saying he's not Mr. Einstein, he's the opposite. And if Einstein is the smartest, then the opposite is the least smartest. Right? And so this is Socrates' irony, and there's a playful competition here, and there's a bit of an edge to it, right? This is snappy commentary. It's a little edgy. But then on the other hand, Socrates claims one thing. And this is in the Apology, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. So he claims to know less than everybody else because the one thing he's aware of is his own ignorance, right? Is knowledge of one's own ignorance knowledge? And I think the answer is yes, it is, because there are other people who are ignorant, but they're not even aware of their ignorance, so they go around acting as if they actually know things, which is a great calamity because they don't know what they're talking about. He says this, "My own wisdom is of no account, a shadow in a dream." Now think about that. A dream is already an illusion, but a shadow of a dream is already an illusion. A shadow in a dream is an illusion within an illusion, several times removed from the real world or the reality. And notice the language of appearance here, which is to say, a dream is an appearance, a shadow is an appearance in a dream. And of course, a shadow is not even of a thing itself. A shadow is just a projection of a thing. So we're several times removed from the real world, this game of appearance and reality. He says, "While your wisdom is bright and radiant and has a splendid future." He's putting him down here, folks. He's being ironic. "Why, young as you are, you're so brilliant. I could call more than 30,000 Greeks as witnesses to your brilliance." So there's some things here. Young as you are, you're so brilliant. So that's a put down from an older man, right? Socrates is in his 50s, in mid to late 50s here. And he's one of the older people there, right? And think a couple things. Age is by definition ugly. The bloom of youth has long since passed Socrates. And all these men are young and handsome and the movers and shakers of society. And they have that appeal that he doesn't have. And yet they're concerned, they're fascinated, they're attracted to him. It should be the other way around. If you look at Pausanias's speech about the older man and the younger boy engaged in a relationship, you see precisely that the older man pursues the younger man precisely because the younger man is handsome. The older man is no longer handsome, and it's the appeal of youth, the same reason that those rich millionaires get with those 25-year-old blondes, right? Young as you are, you're so brilliant. What's the implication there? You can't be wise when you're young. Wisdom is by definition a product of experience, first and foremost. Also rational analysis of one's experience. You can be old and be dumb, unwise. But, the Greeks basically, in these stages of life as they understand it, young person by definition can't be wise because they just haven't experienced. Part of the problem of youth is there are just domains of experience you, for the most part, under normal circumstances, you cannot have had. It gives you a lack of perspective on the world. And who are the 30,000 Greeks? Well, these were the people in the stands of the theater of Dionysus, the audience, the spectators watching his plays, and they were the judges of his virtue, his excellence, right? And it raises a question, and it's raised in the Nicomachean Ethics. We perform actions, and then people judge us. They praise us or blame us. If we act virtuously, we get praised. If we act in terms of vice, viciously or badly, we get blamed. But then there's also a complication. Who's judging you? Because you can act poorly and people will still say you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's called flattery, right? What you want to, Aristotle says in the Ethics, the people you want to judge you are the people of sound judgment, with wisdom and prudence. Is that audience the proper judge of his play in terms of its quality? I think the answer is no. How would you know when someone's wise? I think you'd have to be wiser than them to be able to adjudicate exactly how wise the other people are. Now this competition becomes even more explicit in the next sentence. Now you've gone too far, Socrates. Now why does he say you've gone too far? They've been in this banter, this kind of repartee of comebacks and put-downs in a subtle, ironic way. And Agathon is incredibly aware that he's being put down, right? You've gone too far, Socrates. He's irritated by it. He feels threatened. Well, eat your dinner. Dionysus will soon enough be the judge of our claims to wisdom. So Dionysus is the god that looks over this whole event, and and slightly later it says, when dinner is over, they poured a libation to the god, that god is Dionysus, and sang a hymn, a prayer, a poetry, and in short followed the whole ritual. Then they turned their attention to drinking. At that point, Pausanias said, we've drunk too much, and I'm not going to go into the rest of this. Dionysus will soon be the judge of our claims to wisdom. He's the god of wine, connected with the Symposium, and he's the god of theater. Who has the true claim to wisdom, right? And it's going to come out in their accounts of Eros, who has the better account. And of course, this directly pins the quarrel between poetry and philosophy, because we have a tragic poet in competition with Socrates, the philosopher. So the introductory dialogue concludes with their resolution to give up the music, give up drinking a lot, compelled drinking, and to engage in a night of speeches because they've been partied out from the night before. And of course, they say Phaedrus is the one who proposes it and is the symposiarch, and therefore he makes the first speech, and he proposes that they make speeches in praise of love, because it's one of the most important things to human life. And we might just say very simply, it's one of the most powerful desires, number one, and number two, it's intimately connected with our happiness. And also it's a profoundly elusive thing. So for all these reasons, this seems to be the appropriate subject matter. So then we're going to look at Phaedrus' speech, the bare bones of it in just a moment. The structure of the speeches, there's 6 speeches. They make and then there turns out to be a 7th speaker, and he doesn't speak about Eros. And this is important because Eros is displaced. And the question is, what's the significance of that? Instead, he speaks of ... right? So we turn to now to give a little overview of the speeches. Let's first look at the profession of each character. They all make speeches that utterly reflect and reveal the interest, the point of view, the concerns, the ideology of their profession or their domain of knowledge. Essentially, the way you could think about this is you're looking at the domain of the liberal arts, and you're looking at all the different disciplines relevant to the human being, from rhetoric to politics, to a physician, a doctor of the human body, a comic poet, a tragic poet, and a philosopher. You might call these today the social sciences, actually, or the human sciences. They all the central focus is the human being of all these sciences. And of course, we wouldn't call these sciences today. because science, only people in white lab coats who do use the scientific method, from Descartes and Bacon are real scientists. But in terms of our happiness, what do we really need to know? We need the science of ethics, or the science of politics, which deals with human happiness on an individual and a collective level. So a science for these characters is just a body of knowledge, a kind of total body of knowledge about a given subject matter. So what are their professions? Phaedrus is a public orator. It also means he's a politician, because what do you do as a politician? You make speeches in the assembly trying to persuade your fellow citizens to take a certain path or course with legislation. Pausanias is a gentleman. He's a kind of nobleman of high birth and wealth, and that kind of person would necessarily be involved in politics. And so we said a citizen is by definition, in a sense, a politician, because a citizen is one who participates in the political business of the polis. Now, there were, of course, varying degrees of involvement, but a citizen in Athens was obliged on a minimal level to participate directly in politics, things that were compulsory, decision-making, positions they had to occupy within government. But also, there were a lot of it was still a matter of choice. To show up to the assembly and to try to make a name for oneself, one was not obliged to do that. There was no mandatory obligation, and many people couldn't, because many people were working. Particularly, Aristotle in the Politics talks about how farmers were stuck on their farms, tending their farms, so they couldn't be busybodies at the assembly trying to pass laws to change things the way they want. So here's a politician. Aristomachus is a physician or medical doctor. He deals with the well-being of the human body. Aristophanes, a comic poet. Agathon, a tragic poet. And Socrates, the philosopher. And they all have different understandings of what Eros is, and what its object is, and then the consequence, or the byproduct, or the product of Eros. Let's just stick with Phaedrus and Pausanias for a moment here. Both these characters view Eros as between people. There's a lover and a beloved. And typically the lover, just like in Aristotle, is given a superior place because they're the one doing the active work. There is an emphasis in terms of giving merit or acknowledging virtue in people, that it's based on their active behavior rather than just receiving something passively. So the object is another person, and as Eros, it turns out that while they're supposed to praise Eros itself as an end, as the central topic, they inevitably talk about its effects. And therefore Eros becomes very clearly it's just a means, and therefore it's not the highest and most important thing. The highest and most important thing is not love itself, but what you love. That seems to be an implicit claim of the whole text. And not all objects of love are created equal. That's not any surprise, given what we've learned. Phaedrus is going to tell us that love produces moral virtue and is central to human happiness. Does that sound familiar? No, it doesn't sound familiar. Of course it sounds familiar. That's exactly the kind of thing Aristotle said throughout the entire ethics that we read. There are 4 cardinal virtues: justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. And in the first speech, Phaedrus points out courage as the virtue that is inspired by love. The virtue. And he'll actually give an illustration of what real courage means. So let's turn to his speech. I know that this text isn't rather clear, but let's please have it in front of us. The first thing that we notice is that it is in mythic form. You see these passages that are isolated, speaking about earth broad-chested, are excerpts from Hesiod. Hesiod is one of the great poets of ancient Greece who has a creation myth called the Theogony that explains the origins of everything and the origins of everything leading up to us. So Phaedrus is going to take this myth and riff off of it and actually create his own version of it. He's not simply copying what Hesiod says. He's making it relevant to the speech on Eros. And it shows the kind of innovative ingenuity of these characters, that they can take poetry from their own society and then shape it into their own speech and make it their own. An origin myth. Now, what's the whole function of an origin myth? How something began, how it originated. The understanding is that I can understand the nature of the thing by looking at its birth, its origin, and its development, right? And in looking at that development, I will understand what the thing is. Now, that ties in with Aristotle's, which is not unique to Aristotle in many ways, his whole conception of the nature of the thing, that particularly growing things develop over time, and that you have to see it as it develops to really understand what it is, and that its true nature is it's at its peak, its most perfect form in that process of development. But let's be clear here. Phaedrus says we're going to praise Eros. The first thing he says, love is a great god. Love is a great god. Maybe a great good, great god. That's an explicit praise of Eros, and totally consistent with what's demanded of them. You'll know in terms of the task of the evening. Now, this is going to change over time. You're not going to see people praising Eros in this manner going forward. What happened? And of course, after this first page here, on page 9, he stops praising Eros directly and talks about its effects in human beings. And in fact, what seems to be the great good, the most important thing, is not Eros, but its effects, right? So he's displaced Eros in many ways. Also notice, the obligatory hymn to the god, love is a great god. Is Eros great? This is something that Socrates will actually explicitly challenge. And you're starting to get a sense here of how all these speeches build on one another, and how this is a very clear literary contrivance. It's not just a kind of courtroom transcription, as it were. He says, wonderful in many ways to gods and men, and most marvelous of all is the way he came into being. That's origin myth. We honor him, right? We praise him. We honor the gods, because that's what human beings must do as inferiors. We honor him as one of the most ancient gods, and the proof of his great age is this: the parents of love, or Eros, have no place in poetry or legend. According to Hesiod, the first to be born was chaos. And then I'll come back to it. He says love is the most ancient god. So is love old, or is it young? Now, why does he describe love or Eros as an ancient god? Because in this society, in this traditional society, that which is ancient is superior to that which is new. That which is ancient has more authority than that which is new, because it's been done that way for a long time, and the older the thing is, the more original it is. Entirely inverted compared to our society, where the newest thing is always the best thing, right? And this view of the ancient is the good and the most ancient is the best is a very traditional or conventional way of looking at things, which is interesting, because Socrates' philosophy by definition is not traditional. It does not accept the authority of tradition. It only accepts the authority of reason. And therefore he criticizes Eros, or he seems to criticize Eros, and which is to say he doesn't show proper homage and respect to the god. He says, first to be born was chaos. Chaos is like a void and disorder, two things together. But then came earth, broad-chested, a seat for all, forever safe and love. So this creation myth, what are the two first primordial materials? The chaos is like a void. It's like the face was upon the deep in Genesis 1. The void is like a nothingness, right? So the first two principles to come into existence are earth and love, right? These are like the primordial materials of the cosmos, earth and love. And we'll see this actually picked up in Aristomachus' speech, such that love is an attractive force in the cosmos at large, not just between people or within one's soul. Earth is broad-chested. Now notice this personification. I think what that means is broad-chested, like that. right? Because the shape of the earth, the curving horizon, I think that's what's being, and Achusillus agrees with Hesiod, two poets. After chaos came earth and love too, and Parmenides tells us of this beginning. The first god she designed was love. So love is the primordial force in the entire cosmos. Now, is that not a celebratory statement? That is the force, right? The force. And actually, I think in many ways Socrates and every character would agree with that. And this tells you that it is the most important force. But then, of course, what you love matters too. All sides agree, then, that love is one of the most ancient gods. As such, he gives to us the greatest goods. The greatest goods. What's the greatest good for a human being? That's happiness. I cannot say what greater good there is for a young boy than a gentle lover, or for a lover than a boy to love. What are you talking about, Willis? Now think about that for a second. Creation myth starts at the beginning of everything. And if you've ever read the Old Testament, you see a very gradual succession from the beginning of everything to civil society. And there are no major gaps. There's a kind of gradual build. Here, we move from in the beginning to a social and cultural institution of a very sophisticated, civilized society. And all the history in between is gone, right? There's a logical rupture here, right? And why am I illustrating this? Not just to get in the weeds of the text, but to point out that I think this is a bias of Phaedrus because he asserts his bias without really establishing it rationally. There's no logical causation to move from love is a great God to, and the greatest good he gives us is this pederastic relationship that Pausanias is going to expound upon. What does it say? Phaedrus is just peddling his own wares, his own erotic proclivities, his own preferences, right? Which, of course, on one hand is not surprising at all, but it's funny how bold he is and tries to sneak it into this myth as if this relationship is divinely established or part of nature, when in fact it's just his own personal preference. But of course that's exactly how rhetoric and poetry work. Politicians assert their preferences and try to make them seem like coming from a cosmic source. Hope and change and the future, we will make the future, and we are the future we are waiting for, and all this ridiculous stuff. There is a certain... All right, so he's just established probably his own erotic proclivities here. It's not talking... This isn't an objective reflection of the world, right? Because he hasn't justified this in any way. And in fact, Plato, I think if read carefully, this text is very critical of this relationship, and that comes out in Pausanias' speech. There is a certain guidance. There is a certain guidance each person needs for his whole life if he is to live well, and nothing imparts this guidance, not high kinship, not public honor, not wealth, nothing imparts this guidance as well as love, or eros, capital L. Now think about this. We're almost done with this speech. We need a certain guidance. For Aristotle, he says we need reason to guide us, and experience, and habit, and all these things. Why do we need guidance? Because we're a being that is polytropic. We have alternatives. We are variable. We can choose. We have a life of, we just say, free will. And free will is both a liberation from the tyranny of necessity, but it also creates the problem of what do we do with our freedom? And with our freedom, we need to be guided in an appropriate way. So we need guidance. And that's, of course, Aristotle's message, too. What imparts guidance seems to be a kind of incentive. And we need guidance to do what? On page 10, to live well. To live well. What's another way of saying live well? That's happiness. That's happiness. We need guidance for happiness. That's the message of the Nicomachean Ethics, the broad message. He says, and nothing imparts this guidance, not kinship, honor, or wealth. Nothing imparts the guidance as well as love. I think he's talking about, in a sense, incentives for doing the right thing. Honor is not a sufficient incentive. Kinship, which means family bond, is not sufficient. And wealth is not what we're seeking. It's love that inspires us to live the right way. And then it clarifies, what do I mean by guidance? I mean a sense of shame, of acting shamefully, and a sense of pride in acting well. Without these, nothing fine or great can be accomplished in public or in private. Now, immediately, he has introduced a fundamentally moral question here. We want happiness, and that's acting within the boundaries of well or poorly, good or bad, just and unjust. Happiness means acting in the right way. And it's love that's going to help guide our actions, serve as a kind of compass on this sea of life, and compel us to act, or help us, give us incentive to act the right way. And how does he do it? Through the strategies of shame and pride. Shame and pride. What are we talking about here? We perform actions, and if they're virtuous, we get rewarded with accolades. And if we perform bad actions, we get punishment, or the punishment of shame, where we're humiliated and feel guilt for having not lived up to the expectations of moral principle. And so you have a basic strategy of positive and negative reinforcement, which is what you use with anybody, and children in particular, to get them to do the right thing. And here's the kicker. Whose opinion do we really care about? If they think poorly of us or think well? Well, obviously the people whose opinion matters most are the people we love. So then love is the thing that inspires us to be tremendously concerned with the opinion of the lover, right? We want to do the right thing in their eyes. That's assuming they're a good person, and we love people who are good, right? You see some of the problems here, but if we just look at it in the abstract, you see love is going to be a great motivator to do the right thing, because we don't want to be looked down upon in the eyes of our lover. Love speaks to a certain identification. We understand ourselves through the way they see us. We see ourselves through their eyes, right? So that makes us tremendously, our own sense of self-worth. Remember, Aristoteles doesn't think much of himself, right? And he says this: if only there were a way to start a city or an army made up of lovers and boys they love. Now, you see he's promoting his interests. Theirs would be the best possible system of society. What is a system of society? He's talking about a political regime. A politeia is a regime. It's a constitution. It's a system or order, a political order of powers and institutions of government. He says, for they would hold back from all that is shameful. They would hold back all that is shameful and seek to be honored in each other's eyes. Even a few of them in battle side by side would conquer all the world, I'd say. For a man in love would never allow his loved one of all people to see him leaving ranks or dropping weapons. So he's talking about Greek military culture and strategy, in which they have these phalanx of infantry soldiers lined up, and they all move forward. And what always happened very often is people would chicken out at the last minute when they saw that their sides were getting vulnerable to the attack, and they drop their weapons and turn tail and run, right? But when you've got your lover there, you're going to stand your ground and fight, because you're fighting for them. And if you had a whole city made up of these type of warriors, and I think this can be taken literally and metaphorically, politicians have more care of friendship than they do of justice, Aristotle says, and if everybody were friends, there would be no need of justice. If everybody could form consensual bonds of friendship and love relationships, all the problems of society would be solved. You would not need political institutions to compel justice on people, right? That statement is true. I think it's true. The only problem is it ain't happening. We will never have a society in which everyone is loved equally, or friends, or even grouped up in smaller units of that. However, the general point is true that when they fight, they're fighting for each other. They're not just fighting for some abstract state or some abstract ideology, capitalism, socialism, all this gobbledygook. Who would ever die for these things? You die for your family, you die for your loved ones, right? And he's painting a picture here of tremendous solidarity between people that has effects on the political level. So at first he invoked a moral implication of Eros in that shame and pride, and then he invokes a political implication of it. And this will be really important for when we look at Pausanias' speech. And I want to highlight this that I mentioned toward the end of last video, which is that we tend not to think of love as having anything to do with public sphere, and that it's an entirely private matter. There's a lot of reasons why we believe this. It's partly the political structure of our own society, and very different structure in the ancient world where there isn't such a distinction between public and private at all, and the state is involved in shaping men's souls, shaping men's moral tastes, women's tastes. But it's a fundamental acknowledgement that regimes, political regimes, establish, we think we're the makers of our own lives, but we're operating within a matrix, within a context of a political regime that has already established in general terms how relationships in society are going to work. That's what our Constitution is, actually, and all the state constitutions are. And you would be profoundly naive to think that love was not actually a central political concern, on the one hand, and number two, that legislation could not profoundly affect human relationships in terms of their degree of solidarity and intimacy. And of course, this will play into two things. One, the speech of Pausanias, where he starts to talk about Persian tyranny, and then also when we look at 1984, which is a world, a lens onto a totalitarian world, but that lens is the lens of a relationship between a man and a woman, in which, and illustrates the way in which the totalitarian society works on them to undermine their solidarity and intimacy with other human beings. And it's a very dark, it's a very gray, and it's a very tragic and repulsive world. And I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility when you look around the world historically and also today. So let's just conclude. He's talking about the context of war. What is the virtue a warrior needs? They need courage. And what is love going to do? You want to not be seen as ashamed in front of your lover. You want them to be proud of you. And that is going to inspire you to do the right thing, to do the virtuous thing, right? And that's courage in battle, right? To do the right thing is to march forward and not to drop your weapons and run, right? And what is courage? It is the spirited assertiveness that allows one to pursue one's goals in the face of death, right? And to overcome, courage allows us to overcome the fear of death for a principle that is higher than death, than the fear of death. Think about Hobbes for a second. He despises this, and he seems to think that all human life should be dictated first and foremost by our fear of death, right? And that we should be willing to capitulate to anything if it preserves our life. Here we have a picture of courage in which we overcome our fear of death, and in a reasonable way, not a kind of fanatic way, but because we love the other person. Imagine these people fighting side by side. I go into battle and fight courageously and die because I'm actually trying to preserve the life of the person I love. So then, Phaedrus goes on to give a number of examples drawn from Greek literature. Again, poetry. It's all poetry that's used as examples, right? To illustrate general aspects of the human condition in terms of our relationships with one another. And we're not going to get into the details of those, but in the next lecture we will pick up with a discussion of the next few speeches.